As most of you know, my interest is in theological education, particularly um, training and equipping those who are overseas. And I want to tell you a little bit more about why that's the case. There are a lot of shifts that have happened in global Christianity over the past 100 years. And many of us in the West are not aware of what those are. And I think they'll help us see um, what some of the changes for Christians are, as well as hint at some of the changes when we think about changes in mission strategy in the coming decades. Some of these are already in process, of course. Different mission agencies are aware of these. But some of these numbers, I know they're new to me, at least in the last 10 years or so. And so I wanted to record this video just to help educate people really on what are the shifts in global Christianity and what they mean. So this first video, I'm going to just talk about the shifts and what they are. And then in the next video, it'll be on. I'll talk more about what can we do, or where do we go from here. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint to share a little bit more about this. So I'm calling this "From Every Tribe and Tongue: Changes in Global Christianity and Needs for the 21st Century." So this is brief, at least, and of course, my bias and primary interest is in theological education. So you'll start seeing how that comes out and the significance of that as we look through this. Um, Before I get into some numbers and what the shifts specifically are, I want to talk about the biblical mandate and the biblical basis for what I'm about to talk about. The first passage, of course, is familiar to us on Matthew 28:18 through 20, also called the Great Commission, where Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And so this mandate is given to all Christians, which is to take the gospel into all the world and making disciples of all the nations. The reason this text tells us that we can do that, the reason we can go into all the world, the reason we can make disciples of all nations is because Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth. That Jesus, as a result of his resurrection, is Israel's Messiah. And as we see in the Old Testament, Israel's Messiah is the king of the whole world. And we see that most explicitly in Daniel 7. And this passage in Matthew 28 actually has some background in Daniel 7. So I want to read this. So before I talk about that or read the passage, Daniel 7 is one of the visions that Daniel has. And this is towards the end of one of his visions where he says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And so we see from this passage that Jesus is the one like a son of man. One of Jesus's favorite titles for himself in his ministry is Son of Man. And he's pointing us back to this passage. And he has been given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. And all peoples will worship him, and his kingdom will never end. And so, as a result of Jesus's authority, we too can go into all the earth. The goal, though, as we think about this, what is the goal of making disciples of all nations? So on the one hand, it seems like the goal is to make disciples, but the end result, at least that we hope for, is found in Revelation 7, where John sees this vision in heaven, and he says, "After this, I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" And so the goal of making disciples of all nations is for all peoples to come worship Jesus, the Lamb who was slain to take away the sins of the world. So when we go out and make disciples of all nations, we do it so that we can see this vision come to pass where all nations, peoples, languages stand around God's throne and worship him. And so, as we talk about these shifts in global Christianity, I want us to keep in mind the biblical rationale for everything I'm talking about. This, I hope, sets the tone that we are reminded of why, not just Anna and I, but why we exist, all of us, whether we're here in the United States or whether we're overseas, is that our goal for all things is to make disciples so that we can see people worshiping around the throne of God and the Lamb. So the status of Christianity in 1910. So I want to give a brief introduction here first. But for the last several hundred years, Christianity has largely been associated with Europe, and for good reason in many ways. Most Christians lived in Europe, as I'll talk about in a moment. The Reformation came out of Europe. The Roman Catholic Church is based in Europe. And so for at least 500 plus years, Christianity has been associated there. But interestingly enough, when we look at the first few centuries of the church, of the start of Christianity, um, some of the more well-known figures in church history have come from Africa or the Middle East. So we think of Justin Martyr or Polycarp or Augustine or Athanasius or John Chrysostom. So they were all from Africa and the Middle East originally, or what we call now the Middle East. And so the center of Christianity was, of course, in Jerusalem, in Israel, North Africa, and then it began shifting through time as a result partly of persecution, as a result of the conversion of Constantine, the emperor of Rome. So things shifted more towards Europe at that time. And so, but we are now seeing in our day, and we've started to see it. We started to see it many years ago, that the shift in Christianity has started moving back from North Africa or from North America and Europe back to the South, back to Africa and other countries. And so Christianity, for most of the 20th century, was a well-known phrase is from the West to the rest, where North America and Europe were major hubs of Christianity, and they sent missionaries out to the rest of the world. One term I'm going to use, or two terms I'm going to use that I want to define at the beginning, is I'm going to use the term majority world or global South. I'll probably use global South more. But this refers primarily to the areas of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These terms are used fairly frequently in mission circles, but as Christians and just kind of outside of mission circles, we don't always know what these terms mean or use them very much. So global South basically just refers to countries that are in the southern hemisphere, more or less. Of course, most of Asia is in the northern hemisphere, um, but you have most of South America and at least half of Africa and Southeast Asia that are in the global South. The majority world term is used because more people in the world are in Latin America, Africa, and Asia than in North America and Europe. So majority world is used as well. Basically, this means non-Western nation. So that's why Australia, even though it is technically in the Southern Hemisphere, in this diagram is colored blue rather than red because it's considered a Western nation and not part of the majority world or the global South. So as I use those terms, just think Southern Hemisphere, and that should help, or just think Latin America, Africa, Asia when I use global South or majority world. So I want us to look at Christianity in 1910. So I'm going to use a lot of numbers here, so you may not be interested in that, but this helps us see very clearly the shifts that are happening. And I'm going to use tables with the actual numbers, and then if you're more visual, hopefully these charts will help you out a little bit. But this gives us a very clear idea of the shift. So in 1910, the overwhelming majority of Christians were in Europe and North America. tons and tons of them, of course, in Europe, as you can see from this graph. If you want to see the specific numbers here, we have 91 million in North America. Europe has 403 million. Africa and Asia have 11 million and then 25 million respectively. And then finally 74 million in Latin America. So Latin America is not too far behind North America. But as you can see, Africa and Asia are significantly behind in the number of Christians that existed in the world in 1910. And so when we look at the percentage of Christians that are in the global South, only in 1910, only 18% of Christians are in the global South. Um, Even though there's a lot of people that live in the global South, only 18% of Christians were. And this is made even more stark when we look at the number of missionaries that are sent. So you can see I had trouble actually even finding numbers to put on the graph to show Latin America, Africa, and Asia, because so few missionaries, almost none, came from these three parts of the world in 1910, whereas many, many missionaries were sent from North America and Europe. So to look at the specific numbers, right, you have 20,000 from North America, 39,000, almost 40,000 from Europe, but then only you have less than 500 in each of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So you combine those, you have less than 1,000 missionaries sent from these three parts of the world. And you have a huge number sent from Europe and North America in 1910. And so when we summarize the situation of a world Christianity or global Christianity in 1910, the vast majority of Christians numerically were located in Europe and North America. And these two continents also sent the most missionaries. They not just sent the most, but they sent the overwhelming most. So they sent, North America and Europe sent around 60,000 missionaries to less than 1,000 combined in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So there's a huge disparity in Christians numerically as well as missionaries in 1910 between the West and other parts of the world. And for many of us, this is the numbers we still think in terms of. But as you'll see, as we look at these shifts that are happening, this is not the situation of the world anymore, and it's definitely not the situation the world is moving towards when we look at number of Christians. But I want to fast forward about 60 years in the future. So I have the table here where we start seeing this shift happen 60 years later. Um, and so we look at the number of Christians. So I even have the tables for you to compare. You can pause this if you really want to spend a little bit more time studying it. But you notice Christianity, of course, grows in North America and Europe during this time to 210 million and then 490 million. But then when you look at Africa and Asia, you have large growth that's going, especially in Africa. It goes from 11 million Christians to 142 million in 60 years. That is a huge percentage of Christians, a percentage growth of Christians. Asia also jumps by 70 million Christians in 60 years. And then Latin America also jumps almost 200 million Christians during that time. Whereas with Europe and North America, of course, you still have tons of Christians. You go from 400 million to 490 million, but that's a 90 million growth. Whereas in North America, you have around 120 million more Christians during that time. So you still have growth in those two areas, but not the growth is not nearly as high as it is in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so the question we want to ask is why? Why do Christians grow so numerically in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Well, there's probably a number of reasons for it, but one of them is, and this is an encouraging note, is some of this I think demonstrates that the sending of missionaries from Europe and North America in 1910 and after it bore fruit because Europe and North America sent missionaries to these areas in the global South in large numbers. And we see fruit from those efforts, right? We see more Christians in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which is where many missionaries were sent. And so that's a positive thing that we see the goodness of sending missionaries in terms of the growth of Christianity. That's it's not always a direct cause and effect, but we can see at least that there is some effect from sending missionaries, so many missionaries in the early part of the 20th century. So then you look at another graph here where you can compare the growth, right? And so this is where the change is more significant. So again, you still have Africa and Asia behind where North America and Europe are, but you can see the huge change that takes place there. You also see Latin America surpassing North America in the number of Christians by 1970. And so I should add, this is Christians of all denominations and varieties. So this Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. This isn't just Protestant necessarily. But you can see the big changes that are taking place through this graph. So then when we look at the facts in 1970, you had 18% of Christians in the global south in 1910. Now you have 40%. So it's more than doubled the percentage of Christians in the global south in a 60-year time period. And then I also want to point out, as you can see at the bottom of each of these, I'm trying to put where I got my numbers, just in case you're curious. I didn't just make these up. That I'm trying to cite my sources here, as a good professor always does. So that's from 1910 to 1970. Now we want to look at the current status. So as of 2020, what are the numbers of Christians in these different areas? And so again, you see some more growth in North America and Europe, but not nearly as much. Whereas Africa, Asia, and Latin America, you start seeing Christianity explode by 1920. So Africa, all of a sudden, you have 600, almost 640 million Christians, 640 million. It started 110 years before this with around 11 million. So it's grown by over 600 million Christians in 100 years. Asia now is around 374 million. Latin America has almost 605 million. North America begins to plateau a little bit more with 200 and almost 19 million. And Europe continues growing, but it also is plateauing a little bit, at least in its growth. And this will be a little bit more clear in the graph that you see here in terms of the number of Christians. So you see Africa now has surpassed Europe. Asia is catching up to Europe. Latin America has surpassed Europe. And these trends are just going to continue. And so when we think of uh, the West as the center of Christianity, and as of 2020, that's really not true anymore. It's true in some ways, which we'll talk about when we look at where do we go from here. But in terms of just the sheer number of Christians, uh, Christianity has shifted. It's not in process of shifting; it has shifted from the West to the global South, to the majority world. And so again, this is a better graph where you can see the comparison between 1910, 1970, and 2020, where you see in the last 50 years, Africa has just taken off in its number of Christians, and so has Asia, and so has Latin America. Whereas the growth in North America and the growth in Europe is stagnating somewhat. It's growing, but just not nearly as much, of course, as these other countries. So when we pause and look at the facts of 2020, 64% of all Christians are now in the global South. 50 years ago, it was 40%. Now it's 64% of all Christians in the world are in the global South. Africa itself, as a continent, has 40% of all Protestants, which is crazy to think. Protestantism started in Europe. Now Africa is home to 40%. And it's moving in the direction of over half of all Protestants in the world are in Africa. Not yet, but that's the situation, at least, that we have now, is 40% of Protestants are in Africa, 64% of Christians are in the global South. When we look at the largest Protestant nations now, Well, no, when we look at 1910, all Western nations, right? US, UK, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Canada, Finland, Australia, Denmark, Norway, all Western nations, no Asian, no African, no Latin American countries. When we jump forward to 2015, which is when I found these numbers at least, you all of a sudden US is still number one, but now you have Nigeria and Brazil are now 2 and 3 on the list, and UK has been bumped down to number 4. Um, and then Germany has been bumped down from number 3 to what is that, number 6? And China has now entered the top 5 as well. And so there are, when we compare 100 years here, we have 7 new countries that have entered this list. And they are all from the global South. So there are no new Western countries. Um, you had 10 Western countries in 1910 as the top 10 largest Protestant nations, and now you have 3 of 10 in 2015. And so again, this illustrates the shift in global Christianity, and Nigeria is catching up to the United States. It does not have nearly the population of the US in terms of just raw numbers, but it's catching up in terms of the number of Protestants. And in fact, as of 2020, it's, I would guess, come close to surpassing the US at this point, but official numbers I haven't been able to find yet for this year. Then when we look back to the number of missionaries sent, so 2020 is in the second column there, you'll notice the number of missionaries that North America and Europe are sending has jumped significantly as well, right? So you went from 20,000 to 135,000 in North America. But you'll note Africa, Asia, Latin America, in terms of percentages, it's an explosion, right? It's gone from 350 in Africa to 20,000. 47,000 in Asia from 300, 58,000 in Latin America from 400. So again, Christians are not just growing numerically in these countries, but they are now becoming sending countries. So previously, the global South was receiving missionaries from the Western world. That they needed missionaries because they were so unchristian in a sense of, or so their populations were largely non-Christian. Um, Whereas now these are becoming sending continents and sending nations in each of these places because they are now sending large numbers of missionaries all over the world, sometimes to other African countries or Asian countries or Latin America, and sometimes to the West themselves as the West becomes increasingly non-churched. So we look at these numbers here, and again, obviously North America and Europe are still have tons of missionaries that they're sending. So this is why, in some ways, um, some centers of global Christianity are still in the Western world in North America and Europe. When we look at missionary sent, when we look at finances, the Western countries largely dwarf financially the majority world or the global South churches. But the idea that I want you to see here is that there's huge shifts and changes that are going on, and these are important for us to recognize as we think of mission strategy in the 21st century, as we move into the now third decade of the 21st century. One other thing that I think is interesting to point out is if a 100 Christians represented global Christianity, represented all Christians in the world, what would they look like? So if 100 Christians represented all global Christians, 67 of them would be from the global South or from the majority world, which fits with what I mentioned before. 16 of those 100 would speak Spanish, which is interesting. So almost 16% of all Christians speak Spanish. 10% speak English, which is a lower number than I would have expected. 64 of them are between the ages of 15 to 64. 26, so 26% of all Christians are under the age of 15, which again is something to keep in mind when we think of mission strategy and the age groups we want to focus on. Obviously, it's fine to focus on any age groups, but there is a growing percentage of people under age 15 who are Christian. And so we want to keep that in mind as we think through missions. 79 are in countries with moderate to high corruption. So almost 80% have moderate to high corruption. which means Christians live with ethical dilemmas in these countries that they have to face. If you had to pick the typical Christian in the world now, so if you had 100 Christians and you picked one, the typical Christian would be a non-white woman living in the global South with lower than average levels of societal safety and lower than average levels of proper health care. So again, this points out, number one, that more women than men are Christians in the world, more live in the global South than anywhere else, and then more have, because they live in nations that have high corruption or moderate to high corruption, there's less safety, and there's not proper health care in these places. So this is where I want to pause. So this is the shifts that we've seen in global Christianity between 1910 and 2020. So Christianity is shifting now to the global South, or it's shifted already to the global South in terms of the number of Christians. Now, again, when we think of the Western world, we still have the majority of financial resources. We have the majority of theological institutions, Bible colleges, seminaries. We have more resources. Typically, we are still sending more missionaries. So some of those things have not changed in the sense that the Western world is still a missionary sending hub. It's still a training hub, but the numbers of Christians has shifted already from the Western world to the global South. So in the next video, so this is all hopefully new information for you, and you start seeing these stark changes that have already taken place kind of right before our eyes when we look at the global church. What I want to do in the next video is I want to talk about where do we go from here? What is Christianity going to look like in 2050, in 30 years from now? And then what does this say about our mission strategy and things that we should be focusing on in the upcoming decade? So this gives the basis for what I'm going to tell you in the next video, but hopefully this has been educational for you, because we want to be global Christians. We don't want to just be thinking about Christians in whatever our country of origin is. That's important, of course. We want to still be doing things in our home countries, but the church is not a national body. It's a body composed of people of all tribes, peoples, tongues, and nations. And so we want to keep those in mind, what Christianity looks like throughout the world, because that's what God has called us to, is to be people that are focused on making disciples of all nations.